good things about it. Thank you. We are studying. We've mentioned it's kind of a little bit of geography, a little bit of archaeology, probably more archaeology than anything. A lot of this based on the biblical history, Biblical History Center. I always tell you I have trouble remembering the name because they've changed it like twice. Biblical History Center in LaGrange. A lot of this is coming from the material there. We began last week talking about farming life, or continued. I think we had already started that. We're talking about farming life. We talked about the life of a shepherd, and now we're looking at the life of a farmer. And of course, a lot of these blended. Shepherds were farmers, farmers were shepherds, because that was just the culture and the society. But I'm going to go back a little bit and just cover just a little bit of what we talked about with the threshing floor. We talked about the Israelite altar and noticing the difference between it and the Canaanite altar. These are replicas, obviously, but these altars are both at the Biblical History Center there in LaGrange. Exodus 20:25, we mentioned that, and I didn't give you the verse. I neglected to put the verse up there, but Exodus 20:25, God through Moses gives the command, if thou wilt make me an altar of stone, thou shalt not build it of hewn stone, for if thou lift up thy tool upon it, thou hast polluted it. So the altar was not to become itself an object of worship. It was a means, an aid in approaching God in worship. So God says don't, it's not to be some kind of big fancy thing. And so I wanted to mention that. I also was telling somebody today that I've noticed I had read about a quarter of this book when I started our study. And so I was going to use this book kind of as a guide because I'd been to the Biblical History Center so many times. And I'm beyond where I had finished reading, and so I'm reading as I go and prepare for class, and I'll read ahead a little bit. And I realized today that sometimes they'll just double back and hit something that was like 20 pages previous. So that's the reason sometimes a couple times I've had to go back, and I'm trying to read far enough ahead now that I can get it all together, because I don't like that arrangement. Sometimes they'll just talk a little bit about something and then come back to something they talked about previously, and to me it makes more sense just to put it all together. But anyways, that's why I wanted to mention this couple things about the threshing floor and the altars that typically were beside the threshing floor. Again, if you recall, threshing floors were never just simply a secular place. They would be a place of, not necessarily a place of worship, but worship would be, it would center around thoughts toward God, Jehovah, or Baal, one of the false idols. And so when the crop comes in, who do you thank for the bounty? Do you thank the one true and living God, or do you thank Baal? But again, there were specifics even when it pertained to these altars. Notice here, Psalm 121, verses 1 and 2. Somebody read those, please. It's 2 verses. Probably these verses are meant to be a contrast between the one true God, Jehovah, and the pagan, so-called gods of the heathen. And hold your spot in Psalm 121, because we'll come back to it in a moment. Verses 1 and 2. Do you remember from last week what were the pagan altars often referred to as? What kind of places? The high places. And a lot of times that's the idea. The higher you can get, the closer you're getting to your God. And even all the way back to Genesis 11, some men had that idea, right? We're going to build a tower and we're going to just right up to heaven. So the high places. And the psalmist here says, I'm going to lift up my eyes to the hills, from whence cometh my help. But then makes that contrast. I'm not talking about the high places of the altars. My help comes from the Lord. Because I'll spend all class looking for it. But there's a verse in Amos where it talks about, I want to say it's Amos, the prophet is talking about Jehovah, and he says, it is he that treads upon the high places. And that statement is a slap in the face, as it were, to the what he's saying is God treads upon. He walks all over is how we would say it in our speech. God walks all over these so-called gods because they're nothing. They're wood, they're stone, they're just, the works of men's hands. So, it's a little subtle way of saying, or not so subtle, I guess, way of saying that God is over all, and he is the one and only true and living God. So again, Psalm 121, 1 and 2, contrasting the true God with false gods. What is it? Amos 4:13. Are you there? You got it? Okay, go ahead.
Although he that forms the mountains and creates the wind, and declares unto man what is his thought, that makes the morning and darkness, and that treads upon the high places of the earth, the Lord, the God of hosts, is his name.
Yeah, his name is Jehovah, the Lord of hosts. His name's not Baal. His name is not Molech, Chemosh, Ashtaroth, you name it. His name is Jehovah. He makes morning, evening. He created the earth. He treads upon the high places of the earth. So again, a not so subtle way of saying the false gods are just that. They're false. Here's another reference from, this one's from Isaiah 36. Here's the replica of a Canaanite altar. Again, you see the difference, how fancy this is, and you can see where they become, very, very almost obsessive with just every little detail of this, as opposed to the altars for Jehovah, which he says don't hew the stone. But it's interesting, Sennacherib is coming, he's laid siege to Judah, and he says to the people, he says, well, if you say to me, we trust in the Lord our God, Jehovah, is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah had taken away, and said to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar? He kind of missed it there, what actually had happened. If you recall from Hezekiah's revival, he took away the false altars. He didn't take away the altars of Jehovah. He tore down the high places that were there for worshiping false gods. And so and I wonder when you read this, I wonder if Sennacherib, the Rabshakeh here, it's kind of another way of saying his general is how we would put it. I wonder if he knew that. And he's used kind of some early propaganda here to the people, and he's trying to twist it to turn the people to him, saying, look, your king doesn't know, he doesn't know what he wants to do. First he's tearing down, these altars, and, and then he's going to turn around and tell you to trust in Jehovah. He's tearing down his altars. You better just surrender. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he really thought it was Jehovah's altars that he was tearing down. I don't know. But be that as it may, he kind of got it backwards, because Hezekiah did tear down altars, but they were idolatrous altars. And he says, he did get the last part right, you shall worship before this altar, talking about the altar in Jerusalem, the temple for the one true God. Judges 6:25 is another reference here. Take thy father's young bullock, even the second bullock of 7 years old, throw down the altar of Baal that thy father hath, and cut down the grove that is by it. This is God speaking to whom? Gideon. He tells Gideon, you tear down the altar to Baal, and you put an altar to Jehovah. Not to use that altar to Baal, because again, they're distinctly different. And so he doesn't say just, hey, convert it over. He says, you tear it down. So I just want to mention a couple references there. By the way, talking about altars, here's an archaeological find. This is a place that is a pretty amazing archaeological find. I never even heard of it till I was doing research for this particular lesson. It's called, if I'm pronouncing it right, Baal Bek. It's in Lebanon. So it's probably not the wisest decision to try to go visit that. Might be safe. That might be in an area that's safe. I don't know, but there are some dangerous areas over there. But there was a Roman. It was a Roman city, and there actually is a lot there that they've uncovered. This big temple to Jupiter. There's a big, it's a smaller temple, but it's still big, for the so-called god Bacchus. But here's, you get a picture of you get some idea of scale when you see, I hope you can see, the person up here coming down these steps, and here's a person down here. That's an altar. That's not the temple. That's the altar. So, that just helps you get an idea. And I put that up there because the altar in Herod's temple that they spent, I don't remember the exact number of years, it was 40-something years building. Herod had this, like, syndrome that everything he did had to be, like, just ridiculously elaborate and ornate and just way over the top. And the temple, Herod's temple, rebuilding of the temple, was no exception. I mean, it took several years. I want to say it was 40-something. And the altar there had similar dimensions to this altar that the remains are still there at Baalbek in Lebanon. So that gives you an idea. And some scholars say it's basically the exact same dimensions, but I could not verify that, so I just put similar. This is where we left off last week. You've got this. This would be kind of it's a silo, but it's a reverse silo. And by that I mean it's in the ground. When we see a silo, my uncle for years and years when I was growing up, he was a pig farmer, and he had these big silos. He'd keep corn and different stuff to feed the pigs. And so I think most of us are familiar with a silo. But this is in the ground, so it's reverse. And, of course, you have constant temperatures in the ground, so a lot of reasons for that. But you can see these little niches. They would put an oil-burning lamp. And so even as evening came on and they were carrying grain down in there, or if they needed to go down in the evening or even at night to get some grain or something, you have a little bit of light. Here's a look. This is a replica, of course. This is at the Biblical History Center, these pictures. This is looking down into the silo. And so you've got sacks of grain stored down in there. And there's just another look looking down into it from a little bit. I think I was about halfway down the steps when I took that picture. But you get the idea there, these winding stairs down into the ground, and you could, and this picture you can sort of see. They don't have a full roof on it because if they did, obviously you couldn't see down in there. But you get the idea of some kind of cover that would be put over it to keep the grain from getting wet and so on. And I didn't mention this, and by the way, Jimmy mentioned something to me also that I didn't even think of last week. Another reason your life depended on grain is obviously you have to have grain to get you through the year. You make bread and things like that to eat. But what's the other thing you've got to have? You got to be able to plant it, right, for the next season. So you got to be able to have that seed to plant so you have more grain next year. But obviously after maybe you've stored it or maybe it's fresh and you want to make some bread or cook with it or whatever it may be, you've got to grind it. You've got those seeds now, the grain, corn, and again the King James says corn, but it's grain. You got to grind it and get it into flour or something similar to that. So here's an example. They have a replica of this in the Hall of Artifacts. Again, weren't allowed to take pictures in there, so I found a couple of pictures on the internet that at least give us an idea. But they have I can't remember for sure. Don't quote me on this, but I want to say this is one of the actual artifacts. Some things in there are replicas, and some things are actually things that they have found over there in the Palestinian area. I think they actually have found a 2-person millstone. Again, millstones, by the way, I've mentioned this before in a sermon. I don't know if I mentioned it in this class. Millstones can be ginormous, right? They can be just huge. Or you can have a millstone that's really about hand size. You can grind with it. Similar to, it's a similar concept to a mortar and pestle. You might have a bowl or something and be able to grind with just a hand. That's why if you've ever read, we often think of a millstone, we think of a great big stone, but it was Abimelech in the period of the Judges. How did he die? Well, a lady threw a millstone and it hit him and cracked his skull. Well, the first few times I read that, I thought, that lady's stout. But that would have been a small kitchen-sized millstone, right? Now, she might have been stout. It might have been a big millstone, but probably more than likely this would have been a small kitchen millstone. But it's still enough it's going to crack your skull, right? If it hits you, you don't want to get hit by any kind of millstone, I promise you that. So here's this two-person millstone. You could operate it with one person, but it was, you get your grain in there and you shift it around, and then the other person grabs it, shifts it around and around and around, and hopefully from these two pictures, you kind of get the idea of that. But you'd sit just facing each other, and it was just a lot more efficient. Maybe you've seen the kind, there are a lot of one-person grindstones where, it'd have almost like a trough type shape, and someone you'd have a stone, a millstone of some kind, and you'd go up and back, and up and back. This is a lot more efficient and a lot less strenuous as well. So that's a two-person millstone. Does that remind you of anything? Does it make you think of a verse in the Bible? Jesus says in Matthew 24, if you've ever noticed that, Matthew 24, verse 41. He's talking about, some people take this talking about the end of time. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, actually here he's talking about the end of time, but some people take this to mean there's some kind of mysterious rapture. What he's saying is it's just going to be very sudden. Two women grinding at the millstone, one's taken, the other's left. One's prepared, one's not. And that's the idea. But that's the reference. If you've ever read that and thought, what, two women grinding at the mill? That's what he's talking about, probably a reference there to a two-person millstone. Now, rocks. I want to talk a little bit about rocks before we get into grapevines and vineyards. Rocks are, or were, and really I guess still are, they're building blocks. 90% of their building material was stone. If you want to turn to 1 Kings chapter 5. They're going to build the temple. And so Solomon's got these hewers of rocks, is the way it'll put it. Solomon had 70,000, 70,000 that bear burdens, 80,000 hewers in the mountains. They're in the mountain cutting rock, quarrying rock, we would say. That's beside the chief of Solomon's officers, which were over the work. Verse 17, the king commanded, and they brought great stones, costly stones, and hewed stones. These are cut stones to lay the foundation of the house. Solomon's builders, Hiram's builders, did hew them, and the stone squarers, so they prepared timber and stones to build the house. You may not ever stop and give rock a whole lot of thought. I know I didn't until I went down there to this place. But it's amazing some of the stuff that they did with rock. And you stop and think, okay, how did they accomplish that? I know we hear from a lot of so-called science that man just used to be a complete idiot and just, very recent has had half a brain. But these ancient people were pretty smart, and they were pretty sharp. And you see that when you see some of the building material or some of the buildings that they have built with, especially some of these just massive rocks. But deforestation, there's not a lot of trees over there. Deforestation resulted, you had heavy human occupation, which typically will end up, people are cutting down trees. They're using them for building material. They're using them for fire, things like that. You've got heavy human occupation. You've got uprooting trees during enemy conquest. You see this from time to time, and sometimes they would use it to lay siege. Sometimes just out of meanness, you conquer your enemy and uproot trees, whatever. So, but anyways, not a lot of forest over there to work with. So, you use rock. That's what you got. I told you the saying they had about God sent two angels to distribute the rocks over all the earth, and the one just got kind of tired over Palestine and dumped his, completely out. That was the old Jewish proverb or saying or whatever. But tons of rock over there. Bedrock, quite often, almost always, is available very close to the surface there in the Palestinian area. Metal picks they would use to cut 5 out of the 6 sides of the stone. The 6th one, though, was the tough one, right? A lot of times they would cut, top, side, front, bottom, but you got that back. That's That's the hard one, right? And so they had different ways of doing that. Some rocks would have and do have a natural seam, might be a horizontal seam, that you could use to drive a wedge into it, and it breaks free. Granite is not like that. This to me was just blew my mind, because I never would have even thought of this. But they would take wood a lot of times and wedge it into a water-filled trough. And of course, when wood gets wet, it expands. And so you wedge that wood in there, it expands, and it may not happen the first time. You may have to do this over a process, but you could separate that rock, and that's pretty amazing. And of course, there would be strategic places to do that to help pry it free, and you usually do a number of different spots. But pretty interesting how they would get that rock cut loose. And if you've seen some ancient ruins, you see that they knew what they were doing. It's pretty amazing. Stones might be cut out in a circular shape. You've ever wondered how do they get them to where they were going? Sometimes they would cut a stone in a circular shape, and then they would finish hewing it on site. That's one way to do it. I'd hate to be the guy in charge of stopping that thing if it got away from you. But some big rocks, and then they get them to the location, and then they cut the square, rectangular shape, or whatever. But that's what they would do for some. Some of them, you might have smaller logs, and you could roll them across that for a short distance or something like that. Sometimes they were floated upon the water. You see this in 1 Kings 5. Hiram, those trees of Lebanon, the cedars, him and Solomon work out a deal. They're going to barter for cedar trees. And Hiram says, "You don't worry, I'm going to have my guys cut them down. They're going to float them down to you." And so that's what they did. They sent them in floats. So that's one way to transport. I was reading today about some ancient, I think it was in Egypt, might have been Rome. Some of the things that I looked at just today are running together on me, but some ancient people that transported a lot of very large rocks in barges. Just be kind of the same concept, massive float. Rocks are going to sink, but if you get them on a barge, then you can float them down the river or down the body of water. So that's different ways of transporting them. They have a device here that uses a system of pulleys. And the way this one is set up, Bob, I'm not a math person, so you may have to tell me. I don't know if it's just the way this one is set up. They said this is set up so that every pulley takes off a quarter of the weight. I don't think that's just a given for any pulley, is it? I think it's just the way that one is set up. Size of the wheel, okay. See, I told you, I'm thankful to have you here, Bob. But this one is set up, I think it was supposed to be this one, or it mentioned one, but I believe it's this one that's set up where every pulley takes off a quarter of the weight. So you can imagine that helps tremendously when you're trying to move rocks. So different ways that they came up with. I ran across this, pretty interesting. You can see those people. I'll just go ahead and say they're standing way closer than I'd want to be standing to a rock like that is, looks like it, maybe they're not, I think it's perspective. It looks like they're standing almost under it. I think it looks like it could just fall at any second. But you see the people in comparison. That's a big old rock, isn't it? But that's not the one we're referencing, is this one. It's one of the largest known ancient rocks. Dates back to 27 BC. This is at Baalbek, by the way, where I showed you the temple altar. That rock measures 64 feet long, 19 and a half feet, or 19.6 feet wide, 18 feet tall. Estimated at 1,650 tons. That's, I'm trying to remember because I can't do the math in my head, but is it 3.3 million? 3.3 million pounds, something like that. So I don't know what that comes out to, 1,650, it's a lot. That is a seriously large, and like I said, that's this one. I did some research. It was touted on the website I found it on as to be the largest known quarried rock, but I actually found there's There's a larger one. It's a steel in China. So it's actually been replaced now, and that one is, I think, I want to say it was like in the 1,800 tons weight. But this is number 2. You know where number 3 is? Right there. So number 2 and number 3 right there. Also at that same site is number 5. Largest quarried stones ever, or at least that they found thus far. And those are the ones that have never been moved. Those haven't been moved from that location. And it's funny, that website was talking about, experts are trying to do research to figure out exactly why the Romans didn't move these stones. And people are commenting right and left. They didn't move them because they're so stinking big. They couldn't. I don't know, but for whatever reason, they stopped working on this project. Same thing with the one in China. They abandoned that project, and it just never got moved. But that just gives you the idea of some of the capability. We think, oh, those poor people, they just couldn't do anything. They could do a lot more than we give them credit for. They didn't have massive cranes that they set up to do all that, but they figured out ways of doing it. So, but all that is to say, rock is used as an image, illustration throughout the Bible. Because of its seeming omnipresence, God is my rock. He's everywhere. I mean, if you're in Palestine, if you're from that area, you think of rock, you think of something that is everywhere. If you need wood, you got to go around and you got to look for it. If you need rock, just wherever, it's there. Its strength, obviously, can represent God. Its protective characteristics make it a fitting illustration. You can use it to make weapons. You could take shelter under a rock in a time of storm. You could take shelter on a hot day and cool off, right? On and on we could go. But just a few examples. God is my rock. Psalm 18. Let's get somebody to read that, please. Psalm 18, verses 2 and 3 and 46. Let me get some readers, some volunteers. All right, Caleb, Psalm 118, verse 22, please. All right, Blake. Isaiah 32, verse 2. And, let me get somebody else. Brother Allen, Matthew 21, 42 through 44. And then I'll get this last one, and then I'm going to get some more readers in just a moment. Who's got Psalm 18? I'm sorry, what? Oh, I'm sorry. Matthew 21, 42 through 44. Who's got Psalm 18, 2 and 3? I didn't actually give that to anybody, did I? You got it, Brother Martin? Okay. The Lord is my rock. And then verse 46. We sing this a lot, sometimes here, especially at camp. The Lord liveth, and blessed be my rock. Let the God of my salvation be exalted. So God is my rock. That idea of, He's omnipresent, He's strong, He protects me. And then who's got Psalm 118, 22? There's your prophecy. The stone which the builders rejected, the same has become the chief cornerstone. Jesus is going to mention this, Matthew 21, 42 through 44. You got it?
Jesus said to them, have you never read in the scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to a nation bearing the fruits of it. Whoever falls on this stone will be broken, but on whomever it falls, it will grind him to powder.
All right, again, using that illustration of stone. Have you not read, Jesus says? And he gives this just on the heels of an illustration involving a vineyard that we'll look at when we get to vineyards. But he says, have you not read the stone which the builders rejected? That's become the chief cornerstone, the head of the corner. And then he goes on and says, if this stone falls on you, it's going to grind you to powder. Reminded of that humongous stone we saw there. It's nothing to the chief cornerstone if we don't find ourselves in obedience to him. So, 1 Peter 2 is the one I had, 4 through 8. Again, Peter's referencing this back to that prophecy of Psalm 118. It's also in Isaiah, Jesus being the chief cornerstone. But he says in 1 Peter 2, 4, beginning, to whom coming as unto a living stone, disallowed indeed of men, but chosen of God and precious, you also, as lively stones or living stones, are built up a spiritual house and holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. Wherefore also it is contained in the Scripture, behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect, precious, and he that believeth on him shall not be confounded. Unto you therefore which believe he is precious, but unto them which be disobedient, the stone which the builders disallowed, the same is made the head of the corner, and a stone of stumbling, and a rock of offense, even to them which stumble at the word, being disobedient, whereunto also they were appointed. So it's the idea of this rejected stone. And then Isaiah 32, verse 2. Shadow of a great rock in a weary land. In fact, there's a song we sing. I don't hear it sung as much anymore, but Jesus is a rock in a weary land. And then it goes on and says he's a shelter in the time of storm. So that's the idea there. Shelter, refuge in the shadow of the rock. I hope you know Matthew 16, 18. Jesus says, I say also unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. And the gates of Hades or the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. He's saying there, and of course Peter's name means rock. He's not saying he's building the church on Peter, right? Because Peter's name means pebble, little rock, little stone. Whereas when Jesus says upon this rock, it's the idea of bedrock, foundational stone. He says upon this rock, that is the confession that Peter had just made. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. So Jesus' church is built on that foundational truth that he is the Christ. And then, of course, just a couple of examples here. We won't go read these scriptures for time's sake, but the durability of stones made them fitting for memorials. You see this with Jacob in Genesis 28. He sleeps, he has this dream, he wakes up, he says, this is the house of God. And so he calls it what? Bethel, house of God. El being God, Beth being house of God. So he calls this place the house of God. He said, God is here. So he sets up a stone as a memorial. He pours oil over it, kind of anointing that as a special memorial. Joshua, twice in the book of Joshua, chapter 4, chapter 24, memorial stone set up at Gilgal, memorial stone set up at Shechem. So, again, their durability made them kind of, people tended to use them as memorials. Let's start talking about, I don't know if we'll get through all this. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, you got the bricks, and he said he was wondering if the people that built this building had the idea of stones as a theme, and you got the bricks, but I think this was done later, right? Some of you folks that have been here longer than I, this was done, it's been a while, but that was done after the fact, and that was very, very well done at that. But talking about Vineyard, I don't know if we'll get through talking about the Vineyard tonight, but let's go ahead and get into this. Every vineyard had a watchtower. Reckon what they had a watchtower for? To watch, right? That wasn't a trick question. Just to watch over their vineyard. You had predators. In fact, we'll see a verse about that in a moment. Sometimes animals will come in there and get after it, but probably the most common predator you had to watch out for was who? The two-footed kind, right? The two-legged predators. But everybody had a watchtower. In fact, if you go to Palestine, I'm told, I've never been, but I'm told that there are literally thousands of ruins of watchtowers all over the place where people had a watchtower, a vineyard, and they used that to watch over their vineyard. You see, you couldn't count on the nation's army to come if somebody messed with your vineyard. You didn't have police. You couldn't call 911. Hey, could you send me an officer out here? Somebody's stealing my grapes. So it was on you to protect your harvest. So during the people would build a vineyard, and especially during vintage season, they would have constant vigilance. And so do you know what families typically did during the harvest time or vintage season? They basically camped out in the watchtower at night because you had to have constant vigilance over the vineyard. You want to make sure nobody or nothing is messing with your vineyard. Now, there is an extended metaphor in Isaiah. Turn to Isaiah chapter 5. And he tells us at the end of this drawn out metaphor that he's talking about Israel and Judah. But he begins the chapter saying, "Now will I sing to my well-beloved a song of my beloved, touching or concerning his vineyard. My beloved had the vineyard in a very fruitful hill. He fenced it, gathered out the stones thereof," got the stones out of the soil, in other words, "planted it with the choicest vine, and built a tower in the midst of it." Again, these would be elevated so you could see for a distance, get a better view. "And also made a wine press therein." We'll talk about that later. "And he looked that it should bring forth grapes, and it brought forth wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem, men of Judah, judge, I pray you, betwixt me and my vineyard. What could have been done more to my vineyard that I have not done in it? Wherefore, when I looked that it should bring forth grapes, brought it forth wild grapes. Now go to, I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will take away the hedge thereof, it shall be eaten up, and break down the wall thereof, and it shall be trodden down. I will lay it waste, it shall not be pruned nor digged, but there shall come up briars and thorns. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his pleasant plan. And he looked for judgment, but behold, oppression. For righteousness, but behold, a cry." God says Israel and Judah, they're just like this vineyard, but instead of producing righteousness, judgment, they were just corrupt. And so it's an illustration of God and his people. Sorry, I thought I had that already pulled up there. Jesus' parable of the wicked tenants centers around a vineyard. He let it out to husbandmen. He sent somebody to collect, and what'd they do? Well, they beat some of them up, one they wounded in the head, and then he decides, I'm going to send my son. They'll reverence him, but in that account they say, this is the heir. And what do they decide? We're going to kill him, and then we'll have the vineyard. Now, probably if you were hearing this in the first century, what you would have envisioned, that this didn't, and it's one of those things that maybe I've just never given it much thought. I know I haven't until I'm reading this book and seeing this at the Biblical History Center. They don't have this conversation with each other while the son's standing right there with them. They probably saw him coming at least some distance away because they were in the watchtower. And so they say, oh, look, here comes somebody. And as he gets closer, they say, that's the son. He sent his son. Well, what are we going to do now? And maybe they talk it over and they say, I'll tell you what we're going to do. Let's kill him. And of course, Jesus is making a point about the Jews as they would go on to kill God's son, whom he sent to them. But that all centers around a vineyard. And they probably would have heard that and envisioned these men in the watchtower seeing him coming a ways off and saying, that's the heir. We're going to kill him, and we're going to take the vineyard. The watchtower, of course, because of all this, came to be a symbol of protection. Here's one verse I just put on the screen. The name of the Lord is a strong tower. The righteous runneth into it and is safe. Proverbs 18:10. I told you we were going to come back to Psalm 121. Let's look at that now. Who wants to read for me? Who did I not get a while ago? I had some volunteers. Billy, if you would. Psalm 121, 4 and 5, please. He that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. It's that idea of constant vigilance. The shepherd, he slept at the entrance of the sheepfold, recall, so that he could protect his sheep. He would guard that door. You're in the watchtower. It's vintage season. You've been working hard during the day. Now maybe you're going in shifts and you're trying to keep watch in the watchtower. You know what happened. Somebody gets sleepy, they fall asleep, they wake up, somebody's taken their grapes. But the psalmist says, he that keeps Israel, he doesn't slumber, he doesn't sleep. The Lord is thy keeper. He's your shade upon your right hand. So it's the idea of protection, constant vigilance. You don't have to worry about God falling asleep or letting his guard down or whatever it may be. God is watching over us. There's the watchtower that is set up at the Biblical History Center. It's giving you kind of an illustration there. You'll notice that not a whole lot of cover here, just enough to give you a little bit of shade. You harvested grapes in the dry season, so typically you're going to get little to no rain at all. So they didn't have to worry about that as much. It's just wide open. Again, you're harvesting grapes in warm weather, so you don't have to worry about it being cold. Trying to just close it in so you stay warm. Didn't have to worry about that. Here's another just a random picture of, just to give you an idea, different type of cover that they might use. And but that's kind of how they would. Sometimes you'd have one more like this with a circular kind of a spiral staircase going up to it. Sometimes you'd have something a little more rustic like that. But that's just kind of an idea of those. Let's cover this part. I may have to go through this quick. Grapevines traditionally were grown close to the ground. They didn't have wire. They didn't have ample wood to make lattice work and things like that. So they typically would grow close to the ground. They would use a rock or rocks to elevate the vine slightly. If the grape gets too close to the ground, you know what it does? But I mean the vine, what does it do? It'll take root. And is it tomatoes? They call them suckers. It takes away from the main part, and you don't want that. It's not as good for it. So they elevate it enough so that it's not trying to, start a new plant, because again, especially in an environment where you don't get a whole lot of rain, the grapes sometimes are just using dew, moisture, so that's how they would do that, since they didn't have a lot of wood to make lattice work, and they didn't have wire and things like that. But again, especially during the vintage season, now that's left over from my last slide. I messed up there. I just didn't delete that from the previous slide. But many Bible illustrations surround the familiar vineyard. Again, this is familiar to those people. A lot of Bible illustrations. I'm going to look up just a few of these. I may have to cut out some for time's sake, but I'm in Psalms, so I'm going to grab Psalm 80 in verse 9. 80, verses 8 and 9. Thou hast brought a vine out of Egypt. Again, where did Israel come to the land of Canaan from? Egypt. So it's a picture of them. Thou hast brought a vine out of Egypt. Thou hast cast out the heathen and planted it. Thou preparest room before it and didst cause it to take deep root, and it filled the land. So Israel is pictured as a vine. In Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 15, pictures the little foxes that steal the grapes. Now, the idea there is watching out for the little things in marriage that will cause trouble, and they can, just like the little foxes stealing the grapes, there are little things in marriage that can get out of hand, and you study this even in this context of, I've got a lesson on the foxes stealing the little grapes, little things that can, even in spiritual things, it's vigilance against that. But it's the idea of foxes getting into the vineyard and spoiling the grapes, stealing the grapes. So that's, again, an illustration with surrounding the vineyard. Let me get a couple of readers. Matthew 9:17. Brother Ricky, Tim, Amos 9, verse 13, please. And then I'll get the Matthew reference here. Actually, I've got Amos first. Tim, you got that already? it's a picture of the blessing of the gospel age, the joy, the happiness, the fulfillment. And he says it's like the treader of grapes is going to overtake the one that's planting the grapes. You know, you're planting and you're already reaping and treading. It's time to, you know, all that waiting and effort and all this is gone. And it's not meant to be a literal statement. It's just meant to say it's going to be a time of great joy, great blessing. But again, he uses a very familiar illustration there. Matthew 9:17. The gospel message is the idea of putting new wine into new wineskins. He's not just coming to revamp the Old Testament. He's fulfilling it and going to take it out of the way. Matthew 20 is the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. The guy comes in at the 11th hour and he's paid the same as the guys who had worked all day. That's using a vineyard. Matthew 21, beginning in verse 28, a certain man had 2 sons, and what does he say? He comes to the first one, he says, go work today in my vineyard. And he said, I will not, but afterward he repented and he went. But it's all, that whole parable, it's just a few verses, but it surrounds a vineyard. That's what it's all about. And of course, Jesus uses the idea of a vineyard, the true vine. I'm the true vine, my Father is the husbandman. I'm the vine, you're the branches, he says in John 15. And let me give you an illustration here, and then we'll close with this and talk about stomping the grapes, harvesting the grapes, Lord willing, next week. Here's just a couple of illustrations to show you using rocks to keep these vines off the ground. See that, the whitish here, that's the rock, helping to keep them off the ground, and you see it in this illustration here. That's kind of what they would do to keep those grapes, the vines, off the ground. But Lord willing, as I said, next week we'll talk about gathering the grapes and pressing them. 2 distinct ideas when it came to the collection vat and the stomping vat. We'll talk about that. Thank you very much.